Morning, fish keepers. Cam here from thefishroom.co.nz. Hope you're good. Hope you're well. We've made it to Friday. Let's be happy. Let's do coffee. Other than being very hot, that is very good. All right, so we have ourselves a guest on sitting in the wings right now, so we'll bring everybody on and we'll get on with what we're doing. We've got no admin today, which is a good time. So we have John as normal, and we've got Scott Fellman. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I come.
How you doing, John? You happy? You good?
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah.
Good. Closer to the weekend.
How's Thursday going for you? Because today's Friday, so I'm pretty happy.
That's dragging in. Dragging in.
Cool. All right. So for those of you that don't know Scott, he is from Tannin Aquatics. He's got a very, very good podcast and a very, very good blog that he writes. So if you haven't jumped over and heard that or read that, I definitely encourage you to do so. And if you weren't aware, today's topic is basically going to be on blackwater aquariums and everything that sort of is involved in that sort of thing. So I hope you all enjoy it. So first question I've got for you, Scott, is what got you into the hobby and keeping aquariums?
Well, into the hobby in general, I started literally when I could walk. My dad bred guppies, so there were fish in the household from when I was an infant. And so I literally think I had my first fish when I was about 3 years old. My dad used to get me to get the culls from his guppy breeding projects, and I would raise them in little bowls and stuff. So I had my first real aquarium when I was about 5, so 5 US gallon aquarium. And then I think ever since then, I've always had an aquarium in one form or another, whether it's freshwater, saltwater, whatever. So yeah,
Cool.
It's my life.
Yeah, yeah, very good. So how did that evolve into where you are now with botanical and blackwater type aquarium?
Yeah. Well, without boring you, I'll tell you the short story. As I discussed before the show with you, as a hobbyist, I was in freshwater for most of my life. Got into reef aquariums in the 80s and 90s when I was a kid, really getting into when reefs were really becoming a thing. And I always wanted to do something with it career-wise, and finally the opportunity presented itself quite a few years later. I was partners in an online company called Unique Corals, which is a pretty big coral vendor here in the United States now. And we imported and farmed corals, and that was a really cool thing, and I liked it. But it just, after a while, I got kind of bored with that. I know it sounds weird, but I got kind of bored with it because it was the same. It was becoming a very superficial thing, and prices were going crazy, and it was all about hype, and I just hated it. And I realized my first love was always freshwater. In fact, even when we had this 14,000 gallon facility in this huge warehouse, I always had a blackwater aquarium or a botanical aquarium in my office. So people would come in to buy coral and they'd see this freshwater aquarium, and it was weird, but that was my true love. And then finally I decided, you know what, I want to do something with this business-wise. I want to really blow this idea up, more so for the fun of it than just to make money. And, I've been playing with blackwater and killifish and cichlids and those kind of things all my life. And I thought, maybe I could do something with this and get some people excited about it. So I sold my interest in the coral company and just went all in with Tannin in 2015. Mm-hmm. And here we are 8 years later. And I have to say, the whole botanical method, and we could talk about that later, it's sort of becoming a global movement. It's kind of neat. It's a way of doing aquariums that we didn't invent it. I think we've just sort of elevated it and brought it out of the shadow, out of the darkness. So it was always seen as sort of a circus sideshow for people, like, oh, I saw those tanks. They look dirty or they look dangerous. And I think I just said, you know what? I've been playing with these for so long. I'm just going to start talking about them and sharing my ideas. And we've evolved. And so many other people are contributing. It's been really fun. So that's the short story of how we got where we are.
Yeah. So did you start, or were you doing your blog quite early on with that? Or is that just something that's come through as another way of getting information and ideas out of your head?
It started right off the bat. And yeah. I mean, literally before even, I think the business was really, I don't want to say viable, but really starting, I started with a blog. I always believe in the strategy, and you guys probably feel the same about, like, get information out to people, get them excited about the idea. The money part, the sales and all that stuff, that comes later. I had no competition at the time. There just wasn't anybody selling this stuff. There wasn't one place to buy it. So I wasn't worried about competition. I was worried about educating people about, like, what is this all about? What are you doing? So I spent most of my time sharing the whole idea about it, knowing that, you know, it might take a few years or whatever. I was patient. I figured it'll take time for people to catch on and get into this. And sure enough, there were a lot of people playing with it themselves, and they just sort of found out there's a company now that deals with this, and it's sort of become a clearinghouse for information. And, you know, and it's just snowballed from there. And we've had a really great global community of people that contributed to this stuff. And it's not just about, again, not just about selling things, because I can't sell in every country, as you know, and I just can't. But we can, the ideas are free and they go global. And that's, to me, that's more important, getting people into the idea part.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, deep down, you're a hobbyist. So
Absolutely.
Connecting with other hobbyists is what it's all about. And it'll never be any different when you're a hobbyist, you know, because at your heart, that's what, you know, that's what drives the enjoyment. And
Absolutely.
The money is a secondary bonus, but it does come secondary when you've got a love for aquariums.
Yeah, when you love what you're doing every day and you feel good about it, there's a certain, like, you guys understand, there's like certain authenticity and honesty to it when you're doing something you love. And I think that's what's fun. And especially when it's something that's kind of unique like this, you have to give it that attention. You can't just be trying to sell stuff. I mean, if I just wanted to sell things, I'd be on eBay, I'd be doing all this crazy stuff. I really wanted to sell the idea. And I think that's what makes it more fun. And that's, I think, why we've, knock on wood, why we've lasted so long.
Yeah.
You know, because it was about ideas first, and the sales just sort of follow.
Yeah, you've built a community around botanicals, basically.
Yeah. And it's fun to see that. Again, we didn't invent the concept. I think we elevated it and created. The important thing I think we did is create like best practices on how to use these things, how to find stuff, how to prepare botanicals, how to use them, what they do, focusing on certain aspects. And we could talk about that later, about like why you use them. And I think that that's made a huge difference, because then people understand it's not just a piece of aquascaping material. There's a functional component to it.
Yeah. I think what you said earlier about it, you're pretty much taking it out of the dark, is like you said, it's not been invented. It's just been, hey, look, this is here too, and here's some stuff about it, and it's just sort of gone from that, from my understanding. Yeah, exactly.
And I think there was so much, I don't want to say necessarily misinformation, but a lot of misunderstood information out there. Even the term blackwater, there's an aquarium hobby definition, and then there's an ecological definition, and they're kind of different, you know, because we call any water that has a tint to it, oh, it's blackwater. The reality is blackwater has a very specific set of chemical characteristics if you ask an ecologist, and a lot of it's more about geology than anything else. And you know, blackwater aquariums, put some catappa leaves or peat moss or whatever, and that makes the water brown, therefore it's blackwater. Oh, no. It's very different than that. So there's a whole lot to it. And that's why I like the word botanical method as opposed to blackwater per se. I think it's a little more inclusive.
So one of my questions I've got hopefully later on was to do with like the chemical and chemistry and stuff like that. So because you just sort of touched on it, can we expand on that a little bit?
In terms of
from like the natural in the wild blackwater to what would be considered blackwater chemistry-wise in an aquarium. Just can we expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, in to put it very simply, blackwater in the wild is usually water with little to no carbonate hardness. It has very low mineral content, and it's stained by humic acids and tannins, mainly, believe it or not, more from soil, more from geology. It has its source in geology more so than just leaves and things like that. Because what happens is there's a lot of, like, for example, in South America, the source water for a lot of the Amazon and all those rivers is up in the Andes Mountains. And what happens is there's a geological formation called the Cambrian Shield, I believe it's called, where the surface of this rock has been weathered away and eroded, so it dissolves, you know, certain mineral salts into the water, but very low mineral content in general, and the water has very little carbonate hardness. And when leaves and twigs and things do stain the water, or the soils, which is more common, that creates, and this is a terribly vague description I'm giving, but the best I could do without getting really boring. That's what creates blackwater. Whereas in the hobby, we we see tinted water, and maybe it's soft and acidic, and that's blackwater to us, and that's fine. It's just, I think it's important to understand the distinction, because what's happened for many years, and what's happening now with a lot of new people sort of entering this game, is they say, I have water that maybe out of the tap is 8.4 or whatever. Like our water here in Los Angeles, it's 8.4, 8.6, very hard. That's why reefs and cichlids are very popular here. But and you can put, you could put some peat moss or botanical materials in, the water turns brown, but it's not by definition blackwater. It's hard alkaline water with a little bit of a tint from tannins and whatever else is in the material you use. So I think it's important to make that distinction between the color of water. Color is not indicative of the pH or the hardness or any of that stuff. If you really want to manipulate water, if you really want to geek out about water chemistry, you should invest in a reverse osmosis deionization unit and read up on how that works. And then you can manipulate pH much, much easier if that's your goal.
Yeah.
If you just want to have a nice looking tank, you can keep the water 8.4. We know that, or whatever pH you have. I'm curious, both of you guys, like where you come from, Cam, what's the tap water pH? Is it
almost spot on, mid-sevens?
Okay, so good. And John, what's it like where you are?
It's usually about 6.7.
Oh, that's awesome. Wow.
Yeah, it's really soft water here.
That's cool. So, I mean, again, you have probably more water that's more malleable. You can do things with it. And Cam and I have to maybe, lower the hardness, and then we can play with the alkalinity. So, yeah, I mean, that's in a nutshell, I think. Try to clear up that misnomer right off the bat. I think it's important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the parts per million comes out of I do use an RO filter on occasion, and when I do a test on the water coming straight from the tap, it's as low as 20 ppm.
Wow.
So
it's
really good quality.
That's really good quality water.
Yeah, no.
That's amazing. Most of us have to do a lot of manipulation to get the water to that. I mean, I'd be super happy. I would be thrilled if my water came out of the tap like that. I wouldn't know what to do with it. Like, done.
I mean, it does mean that water changes are very forgiving. So you don't really need to do much in the sense of kind of remineralizing or buffering, other than the very, very basic of dechlorinating.
Yeah.
And everything else just kind of clicks.
Ready to go.
Yeah.
Wow, that's awesome.
So you've mentioned the botanical method a couple times already.
Yeah.
Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that as opposed to blackwater aquarium?
Yeah. The reason we come up with the term botanical method is when I first started, I called it botanical style, and I realized what was happening. As we got a little more visible and the idea got a little more popular, people were thinking botanical style, like ADA style, or what, like it was a style of aquascaping. I'm like, no. The aesthetics are a collateral benefit of the function. So I changed it to botanical method, because what it basically is we use natural materials like leaves, twigs, seed pods, bark, all those kind of things, some of which you can collect yourself, some of which you'll have to buy from various sources. We use those materials not only to hopefully influence or manipulate the water quality, but to create a set of ecological benefits. So in other words, what happens with terrestrial materials like plants and seed pods and wood and all that stuff, when it gets submerged in water, it starts to break down and fungal growth occurs. As anybody who's aged a piece of wood for their aquarium can attest to, you get those fungal growths and biofilms. And there's a whole host of different organisms, microorganisms, that arise out of that. Well, so rather than, scrape that stuff off and siphon it out and freak out about it, I realized that if you look at any number of pictures, and we have plenty from a lot of our contributors who've been around the world, if you look at these pictures of the Amazon or some of these habitats in South America or Southeast Asia, the wood, the leaves, they're covered in fungal growth, biofilms, turf algae, that kind of stuff. We embrace that. So it's a much more holistic natural style. We embrace it because these organisms not only at the oversimplistically, they help filter the water to some extent, but they provide the basis of what's called a food web, because other organisms feed on them. And when you start taking out, the fish will actually, to a certain extent, get supplemental feeding from some of this stuff. And when you start taking this stuff out and siphoning it out, if you think about your tank holistically, you're essentially depriving these lower organisms of a food source, and you're interrupting that cycle. And I think part of the problem with, I don't want to say aquariums in general, but natural aquariums over the years, is that people still employ very aggressive maintenance processes. Siphon the substrate, detritus is bad. You take that stuff out, that's food for other animals, which support the entire tank. So I think when you look at it a little more holistically, I always talk about in my podcast and the blogs, mental shifts, make these mental shifts. If you make these mental shifts that kind of say, wait a second, I'm looking at my tank a little differently than I do, a typical freshwater tank, suddenly it all sort of makes sense. And the look, yeah, it looks different. Not everybody likes seeing biofilms and fungal growth and decomposing leaves, but that's what nature wants to do.
Yeah.
And that, again, if you Google underwater, say Igarape, which is or Agapo, which is a flooded Amazonian forest. It's a seasonally flooded forest. It's literally a forest floor with leaves and twigs and branches and stuff on it that every year when the rains come and the rivers overflow, that becomes an aquatic habitat, like the cardinal tetras and all the characins and all that. They migrate into those areas during the wet season. So the terrestrial forest floor becomes an aquatic environment. What do you have in a terrestrial forest floor? Leaves, twigs, all that stuff. What happens when these items hit the water? They start decomposing. They acquire biofilms and so forth. That's what nature looks like. And I think, I'm sorry, I'm just going on and on. You stop me if I'm talking.
That's okay.
But like one of the things that I get frustrated about, and it's not in a bad way. If you listen to my podcast, you probably hear me rant about it. We love to use the word nature or natural in the aquarium hobby. And God bless Mr. Romano. I mean, he did a huge amount for the aquarium hobby, and I get it. And the word nature aquarium, what he did was very different. But somehow that has gotten appropriated. And now the thing that I'll see is these really highly crafted, beautiful aquascapes, which are amazing, but they're sterile as hell. And people say, oh, it's a natural, or it's a nature aquarium. Well, it's nature in that it uses plants and there's some bacteria, but that's not what nature looks like. And I sometimes take it to the ridiculous end. I fear that, people that go to these wild habitats, they'll see this decomposing slop in the water and plants and say, that's not nature. We need to save it. We need to fix this instead of it for what it is, because we're so accustomed as aquarists to nature equals this perfectly manicured, ratioed aquarium. And that's the only thing. It's not what Amano did. It's what the culture did kind of after him. And if you look at Amano's earliest work, he took pictures of underwater blackwater habitats. And he talked about the concept of wabi-sabi, the transient nature of things. It's a Japanese design philosophy. It applies very much to what we do. Your tank starts out one way and it evolves. It's an organism of its own. So again, I'm sorry if I'm just going on and on, but I think that's super foundational to what we do.
Yeah. I think it's an ecosystem at the end of the day. And I think Campbell agreed that the more people that we have on Friday mornings, the term or this need to build an ecosystem within your aquarium seems to be popping up more. And it just makes more sense every time that we hear it. Everything has its place. Everything, just like in nature, as you said, everything needs to work on top of each other for it to work. And if you can nail that as at the base of the substrate and then work from there, or just let it do its own work, pick the right product, and then just sit back and go, let's just watch this turn.
Nature's been doing it for eons. I think she could take over your aquarium and do just fine, but we're so afraid to sort of let go and go, oh, what'll happen? What'll happen if I don't scrape this stuff out? What happens if detritus from decomposing leaves accumulates? What happens? I've never had a pH crash or any of these weird things happen because I know the basics of fish keeping. I do water exchanges. I just don't siphon every inch of the substrate out. I don't siphon all the stuff off. That's the difference. I'm a believer in water changes. Absolutely. I do 10% water changes weekly. I'm fanatical about that. But I'm not fanatical about sterilizing my tank and pulling every single thing I can out of the out of the substrate or whatever.
Everything.
Yeah, I think that we do good disservice to that when we're trying to do this whole thing. Then we develop a dependency on filters and things like that.
I know. I wonder why.
I don't know.
I think there's a mindset that because the water is dirty looking, that the water parameters are not right. But the reality is, you're still keeping an aquarium in exactly the same way. You're still wanting to keep where you need your water to be for the sake of everything that's inside the water.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's a great point. Again, color of the water is not indicative of the quality, the pH, the alkaline, any of that stuff. And I dare say that some of my deepest, darkest aquariums, I think the water quality in those is better than many freshwater, super clear freshwater aquariums that I've seen. I've never had a higher nitrate than maybe 10 parts per million, if that. And usually it's like runs 5 or less or undetectable. I don't have pHs plunge and go up and down and all the kind of things people freak out about. And I've done some pretty crazy experiments, no substrate other than leaves. I've done twigs as substrates. I've done all sorts of stuff. These tanks are as stable as can be if you let them go and if you use common sense. And I say let them go, I don't mean ignore them and ignore husbandry. I mean, if you don't mess with them all the time, you don't have to add anything or whatever, just common sense.
One of the aquariums that I set up several years ago, which I don't have anymore, was very, very much based on some of your listening to your podcasts. Very, very heavy leaf litter on the bottom, neon tetras, and that was it. And it's the best I've ever had neon tetras, coloured, conditioned, sized, the entire thing. And that was a real mind shift change for me. Everyone's going, neons are really sickly. I just don't think we keep them in the right way. And yeah, like a couple of things you've said so far, it's all just triggering back to me this aquarium that I did that was very closely based to what a lot of your work has been.
It's funny you should say. I mean, because people ask me what's the easiest type of botanical method aquarium I can do. It would be just what you talked about. I would literally do a tank, a small aquarium with leaf litter of any sort, basically. We talk about that later, but some leaf litter, maybe some twigs, oak twigs, or whatever kind of trees you have in your area. And that's it. And that's your aquarium. And your fish will look amazing if they're from an appropriate type of environment. You don't need any fancy filtration. You just need whatever filter you're going to use. You don't obviously probably use carbon because if you like that dark water color, you don't want to take that out. But yeah, there is something beautiful about that. And the fish that come from these type of habitats adapt to it amazingly. Like you would keep Rift Lake cichlids in a blackwater aquarium. Why would you keep blackwater fishes in a clear water, brightly lit?
Exactly.
Doesn't make sense.
Yep. Cool. So we've just had a question from the audience, and it's got a star on it, which has totally got my attention. I don't know how they did that, but that's awesome.
That was me.
Oh, that was good. Oh,
I was just looking at it, and I thought I'll come back to that later, so I put a star on it.
Oh, cool. Okay. So how do you maintain your blackwater tannin aesthetic with water changes? This person's recently taken to aging their water with a handful of older cones overnight before the water changes.
That's a great question, and he actually answered his own question very well. And I love the way he prefaced it with aesthetic. The way you keep the water tinted is to do exactly what he did. If you age your water or if you store your water, throw in a few leaves and you'll keep that kind of aesthetic tint. Now, granted, assuming the base water you're starting with is the same water that you have in the aquarium and the parameters aren't way off, just like any other water exchange, that should be just fine. Yeah, and that's a great way of keeping the tint, as we like to say. So yeah, I want to touch on one thing too, because people ask me this all the time. Since you mentioned aesthetic, like, how many leaves per gallon? If anybody tells you how many leaves per gallon or liter or whatever you need, they're full of it. There's just no way to know that. That's why I take a real issue with that. We don't even know how many of what tannins, and there's like hundreds of different types of tannins, are found in the tropical environments of our. I've yet to find a study that shows what tannins are specifically found in some of these tropical environments. So I don't even know what tannins come out of some of the leaves and seed pods and things that we play with as hobbyists. So to make an assertion like you need X amount of leaves per gallon of water is just so ridiculous. We don't know. It's a grand experiment, and that's the thing that freaks a lot of people out. There is no add 5 drops of this or it's faith. You have to experiment, and that's part of the fun of it.
Every leaf will react differently as well.
Yeah, you could say like there's a guideline of like, add a few of these, start slowly, which we always recommend, but there's no recipe really.
Yeah. So I know that older cones, for example, seem to release quite a lot of tannic acid and a lot of really deep coloration really quickly.
Yeah.
So there'd be like an item that I'd say is quite a strong botanical characteristics for them. Do you find even from like one lot of older cones to a different sort, there's a difference in that, or are they kind of consistent through every item we're using?
That's an amazing question, and I've never done like diligent testing of pH impact on a given sample of water of a set pH to do that. A guy in, I think, the Netherlands, I found it online somewhere, he actually did a study with alder cones to see how they would manipulate pH, and they do, and he was very methodical about it, and that was really interesting. I don't remember the name, but maybe if you Google alder cones aquarium, you might find this, because it was a really interesting little article. But there is no, you mentioned it well, each different material that you use, depending on where it came from, when it was harvested, how long it's been dried, whether it's been wet before, you don't know how much of these things it's going to impart into the water. So it's very much as much an art as it is a science. And that's why I've emphasized a whole lot more about the ecology aspect than about the blackwater aspect. Because if you want to make blackwater, there are ways to make blackwater. I mean, straight up RODI water, you can lower it with various acid solutions, which, and you could add liquid human concentrates or whatever. Again, how much, I'm not sure. Maybe get the desired effect. If it doesn't kill your fish, it must be doing something. But there's ways to be more scientific about it, I'm sure. When I see these blackwater extracts, it's cool. They impart tannins and humic substances, which do have documented health benefits for the fishes that reside in these types of habitats. But again, how did they arrive at 5 drops per gallon? Where did this come from? What kind of study did they do? And what kind of tannins or humic substances and things are being imparted into the water? And what benefit are they? We just don't know. So a while ago, a lot of people have you ever heard of rooibos tea?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
A lot of fish breeders for years have used rooibos tea. It tastes good too, because it kind of colors the water, and people like to say, it puts tannins in the water. It does, but I don't know which ones. I don't know what their impact is. Apparently it works. Angelfish breeders use it. Discus breeders use it. But people use, tea bags of these things, and I get it. Same with peat moss. It's like we just don't really know. I mean, we kind of know, but we don't know, if that makes sense. So we know it does something. We just don't know what. That makes me uncomfortable to market a product like that. For a while, we were selling tea bags of botanical materials, and finally I said, you know what? No, I'm going to stop doing that, because first of all, you have to develop a dosage, how many of these per liter or whatever. And you have to be able to tell people what it's doing. And I honestly don't know what it's doing. I know that when you put botanicals in an aquarium, they're colonizing with biofilms and fungal growths, and you're developing an ecology. And yeah, the water gets tinted as a side benefit. But when you're just using something for an effect, I can't lab test this to the point where I know exactly what the right dose is. So I just don't believe in those types of things. If you like them, use them. Blackwater extracts are cool. I just don't know what they do.
Yeah.
Something. They're not killing your fish. Of course, they're good products. I would rather be more of the art than trying to be scientific about something I can't quantify. And that's the reefer in me, I guess. We just need to know. Sorry, I can go on, and I know I tend to run on, but so you stop me if I'm talking too much.
No. You just continue to do. The more you want to get out, the
I like to get this. Yeah, it's nice to have a nice audience to hear this.
Yeah,
I think if you're looking for a quick fix to get the benefits of tannins, then you're going to find a chemical option for that quite easily, or a bottled version, because that's your nature. That's you're taking that scientific approach. But if you're looking to enjoy, and it is more like you said, for the art and the aesthetics, you're just going to throw stuff in, because then it opens up entertaining value as well. But I think for people that are looking to just breed, then there is going to be that quick fix of the drop.
Right.
Well, it's each to your own, I suppose.
Correct. There's no wrong way to do it. No. I just know that when I talk about method, I wouldn't consider those things part of a method necessarily. I would say that they're fixes, something you can do. You're conditioning your water by doing something, whereas I'm talking more about creating an ecology in the aquarium. That I do know happens, and that we can talk about, but just trying to get the look. I mean, you can put a piece of Malaysian driftwood in your tank and you'll get beautiful black water. Just don't use carbon. You'll have gorgeous water. Same spiderwood, it's that simple. If you want the look, there's tons of ways to get the look. And many people are totally happy with that. And I would be happy with that. But I just don't like when people say, oh, it's a blackwater aquarium. It's a blah, 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 blah. Not really, because it looks like blackwater, but it's not blackwater in the ecological sense. No.
Because we've had another question on comments. I think this might have been leading from, you were talking about the food web before.
I love this question.
Which is also not the first time we've had someone come on and talk about the food web. Again, that's another thing that I believe is beginning to roll through people that are keeping Yeah. So if you follow some of these methods, could you potentially create a self-feeding tank, as in like less food going in because there's enough for your tank inhabitants to forage on?
Love this question. Your readers or your listeners are like really sharp. I like that. That's a great question. And I addressed that a few years ago because that's always been my hypothesis, that with all this material, and if you go online and go on Google Scholar or some of these sources and try to look at the ichthyological descriptions of a lot of fishes, the gut content analysis is really an interesting part of those descriptions. A lot of what fishes eat is detritus, fungal growth, fungal mycelium, the little filaments from fungi. Again, detritus, bacterial biofilm. So yeah, those are the low guys on the totem pole. That's part of the food web. So yeah, I played with this experiment a few years ago. I knew that this was right, because if you look at any aquarium, you see fishes picking at rocks and wood and stuff. They're eating something, right? I thought, what if the aquarium is designed? What if it has materials that are designed to foster these types of organisms? You're definitely creating a self-feeding system. So yeah, when leaves decompose and you get the biofilms and fungal growths, you can do it. So my theory was I set up an aquarium. It was one of those ADA 60Ps, kind of a long, low aquarium. And I set that up, and I all I did was put a layer of live oak leaves, but you can use any kind of leaves, live oak leaves and some twigs. One of my favorite configurations. I admit I pre-stocked it a little bit with some paramecium culture, but that's it, just for a few days. And then I added 20 or 24 green neon tetras, Paracaridon, simulant. Had great little fish.
Yeah.
And after they were out of quarantine, I didn't feed them. I had that tank going for 18 months, and I never fed once. And I had 2 actual spawning events where they actually spawned. I changed the water. I didn't ignore the tank. I just didn't feed it. And I was like, well, maybe I shouldn't do this. And these fish were as fat and happy as any green neon tetras I'd ever seen. I did the same with my 2 Kano tetras, which is a very expensive fish, but I believed in it that much. It absolutely can be done, I believe. Now, could you have an entire huge aquarium self-feeding? I don't know, but it would definitely provide some supplemental food. The other interesting thing, and some of my friends that breed fish have kind of gotten into this, is you could raise some fish, spawn fish and rear the fry in one of these types of tanks, like a botanical nursery tank.
Yeah.
What did little fish eat? Small microorganisms. You can self-feed. I found this with killifish. I mean, anybody that's ever kept a killifish or, I don't know, lots of little fish. Like I'm thinking of like killies, maybe certain tetras like emperor tetras. You ever just look in your tank one day and you see baby fish there? What are they eating? They're finding something. They're not eating the tetramin that you're throwing in there or the brine shrimp. They're hiding and eating stuff. So there's food in aquariums. Is there enough to raise thousands of fish? I mean, it would probably take a little more concentrated effort, but I think it's possible. Absolutely.
I guess it's the whole balance thing, making sure what's in there is sustaining what's alive, and the whole circle of life just continues in one. Dump too many fish in, it's not going to sustain itself. But if you've got a good number, the colony and the population will sustain its own ability.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I'm a big believer in it. So I think it is possible. That's a great question. And I think there's plenty of room for experiments on that.
Yeah. Cool. Do you want to bring up the next question, John? Or do you want to move through from there? Yep, cool.
So I found the colour of the water when it came out to be blackwater botanical aquariums to be secondary to me. The primary goal was to provide a complex habitat for my Amazonian or Asian fish. and to observe the ecosystem, i.e. the small organisms and things.
Yeah, that's a beautiful observation. And he mentioned something interesting there too, he or she, a complex habitat. Because you're right, it's not just a aesthetic in terms of the water or the ecology, it's also a physical habitat. And again, if you look at underwater photos of flooded forest streams and Amazonian, rivulets and so forth, there's a lot of leaf debris and all that stuff in there. And there's a very complex hierarchy of fish life that lives in there. And they make use of that. That's why I love flooded forests. That's like one of my obsessions. If you see me listen to my podcast or read my blogs, I'm always talking about those because they're such a fascinating environment. The topography, the underwater topography is interesting. Leaves and fallen branches and stuff. That's amazing. It's kind of what we try to do in general aquarium aquascaping. If we put a piece of wood in there and then we have plants, it's kind of what happens underwater naturally. So there's a physical attribute to these environments that we don't talk about enough. Cichlids will spawn in these little seed pods just like they would a clay pot, a flower pot or whatever that we'd use. So it's the same kind of mindset. They'll use what's available to them.
Just on a slightly roll back, not quite as technical points, lighting and filtration when setting up tanks like these, how important are these elements? Because obviously they're quite important when you're setting up a general clear water aquarium.
Right.
How do they come into play when you're looking at botanical type aquariums?
I think that's another good question. You can use all sorts of different filtration systems. You can go without a filter. I personally have always liked filter. I don't like stagnant water in my house, so at the very least I would use an air stone or some kind of aeration. But you can use canister filters. You can use hang on the back filters. You can use sponge filters. You can use those Manton filters, what they call them, under gravel filters for that. You can use almost any filter technology. The idea is you don't want to scrub the heck out of the water. You don't want to take if you like the blackwater aesthetic, the look, you probably don't want to use a lot of carbon, maybe a little bit of carbon or something a little less aggressive. You don't want to, if your fish come from an environment that has a lot of current, well, then, use a fair amount of current. But for the most part, you just want to use common sense, but you can use just about anything. The long and the short of it is any filter will work, in my experience. Yeah. I think for a lot of people that like the aesthetics, probably a canister filter is good because you don't see it in the tank. I use a lot of all-in-one filters in my own tanks, aquariums that have the filter built in the back, and I don't put anything in them, no media at all, just maybe a filter pad that I change out. Because botanical aquariums do produce a lot of, I don't want to say detritus, but bits and pieces of decomposing leaves and things that get sucked into the filter and they can
particles through the water.
Yeah, particulate. So, but I like that look in the water. I just don't want that stuff getting into my filters because I have to clean the impellers and stuff. So super easy.
Yep. And lighting wise, how do you find that playing a part in aquariums?
Yeah, well, two things. If you're doing it, most of the tanks that we do don't have live plants in them. Just because I'm not a huge live plant lover. I use LED lighting. I set it to whatever aesthetic setting appeals to me, and that's that. If you're growing plants, I've actually read studies done on blackwater ecosystems in the wild, and the limiting factor for the growth of algae and aquatic plants in these habitats was not the chemistry, not the substrate, it was light penetration. So what does that tell you? Well, crank the light up if you want to grow fish in blackwater, or you want to grow plants in blackwater aquariums or tinted water aquariums. Or use plants like Java ferns, cryptocoryne, low light Labucephalandra, that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's always plants that can grow in these types of aquariums, and they go very well.
Anytime anyone comes in and talks to me and they're wanting to get involved in this sort of aquarium and they really want plants, crypts, Java ferns, Anubias, they're all on the list because the penetration of the light's not going to affect them too much, and they'll be just quite content chugging along in that water with them. So
absolutely,
it's definitely doable.
Yeah. I think planted blackwater, planted blackwater aquariums, tinted water aquariums are getting more and more common, more and more popular all the time. There's a lot of really talented plant people that have forgotten more than I'll ever know about plants that they'll tell me, oh yeah, this plant comes from blackwater habitats in the wild. This plant's found in this. I've grown, what plants have I grown in blackwater? The aforementioned cryptocorynes and stuff like that. is it polygonum or polygonum? I forgot how to pronounce it, but this species is called I think it's polygonum. I'm probably butchering that name, but that's I think it's a South Asia plant, but it's found circumtropically. That one grows really well. I've done water sprite in that type of thing. You just experiment.
Yeah. Do you have much success with floating plants?
Yes, those are probably easiest because they float, obviously, and they're right at the water surface. People use those. What do they call those? Red root floaters.
Oh, yeah.
Salvinia, duckweed. I mean, yeah, those are the kind of plants that grow very easily in just about any type of a tank. Even hornwood, which is a commonly found in these types of habitats. Yeah. So it's a floater too. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Is there any potential drawbacks of going down this route? Obviously, you're not going to be going with like Tanganyikan cichlids, for example. Right. But have you noticed any negatives that have come through from this?
Yeah, the negatives are this. The things that I always was afraid of when I first started is somebody would buy stuff from me when I was selling stuff and put it in their tank and kill their fishes. I mean, there's the potential negatives are usually human error. They're all caused by human error. The two things are, number one, using material that may be polluted or collected from an area that's contaminated with, industrial runoff or whatever. Or as we talked about earlier, some people say, oh, I can go to the craft store and find these really cool shells, or they put lacquer on them to preserve them, and they'll kill your fish. Or the other thing that can go wrong is if you have an established aquarium and you're like, yeah, I want to do one of these leaf litter tanks that Scott and Cam are talking about, and you dump, 2 kilos of leaves into your 40 liter aquarium or whatever, the resulting drop in oxygen levels because of the bacteria bloom, it could nuke your tank and kill them. So yeah, you have to use common sense. You have to boil and clean some of this stuff because you don't know what kind of pollutants it's picking up. So those are the drawbacks are generally people going too fast, not being patient, and not understanding what they're doing. Again, the reason why I changed the approach from botanical style to botanical method is I didn't want to give people the impression that you could just put leaves in a tank and it's just for a look. They break down, they decompose, they create detritus. If you don't understand that process, and if you don't want to understand that process, well, then you maybe don't want to play with that. There's a little bit of trade-off here and there. You have to realize that you're managing a small closed ecosystem. And if you start, you freak out every time you say, oh, there's biofilm, siphon it out. Well, that's going to create an unstable ecosystem, and pretty soon something else is going to get out of whack. We're adding a lot of decomposing stuff to a tank. If you're lighting the hell out of it with bright light, you're going to get algae because algae thrives on light and nutrients. Yep. So it's common sense, but people tend to think that when you do this, it's the worst thing that I ever hear is when some people think that, well, these are great tanks because there's not a lot of maintenance involved. That's absolutely not the case. It's different type of maintenance. It's understanding, measured maintenance, but there's no set and forget. I must say they're the easiest tanks you can run in my experience. I'd rather run one of these than a high-tech planted tank or
and I think one thing that I did notice and one thing that really appealed to me when Tannin Aquatics launched in 2015, it was, I would say in the UK anyway, parallel to the aquascaping explosion. James Sheen, the UK blackwater guy, he was an aquascaper. He had aquascaping Facebook groups, but he made an instant switch to Botanicals, and he never turned back. And I think you can be just as creative, but you're not restricted to the discipline of having to have it perfect, which is where a lot of people fall on aquascaping, and they're put off and they come away from plants altogether. But with a blackwater or botanical based tank, you can be hands-on, you can get creative, and it's far more forgiving aesthetically than any other type of aquarium.
What a great point. And that's absolutely true, because we have guys that have good friends that are sort of in our community that are very talented aquascapers. I mean, these guys, anything better than anything I could ever hope to do, real artistic style aquascapers, but they love the tinted water. They love the leaf aesthetic. They love the fungal growth. They're kind of getting it. you can do that. You can do it very naturally. You can do it laboratory style, where it's just, dump this stuff in. Or you can be like me, kind of in the middle. I'm not an aquascaper per se. I just know a sort of look that I want, or I want an environment I want to emulate. Usually it's about emulating a certain habitat. What I'm waiting for is, I actually saw in the United States, we had a guy that entered in the Aquatic Gardeners Association. I don't know if you've heard of them. It's
AGA.
Yeah, the AGA. They had a biotope category, and he entered his. He did it as an igapo, a flooded forest, and it was a tank filled with decomposing leaves and fungal growth. He took 3rd place in that category. That's the highest placing. So when I found out that, I was like, oh my God, it's amazing. Because they're judging under purely aesthetic type things, and the judges made some observations that were incorrect about the function of the tank, based on their prejudices of the way they judge things.
Yeah.
But I would love to see one of these entered in the IAPLC or whatever.
Yeah.
I forgot the acronym, but yeah.
IAPLC.
IAPLC. Yeah, I'd love to see one entered in there. I don't know if it would work because it's not a planted tank necessarily. So
chuck a crypt in there, you'll be fine.
Bono himself would smile. The judges now might just freak out, but I think it would be really cool to enter one of those. Yeah. I'd love to enter my leaf litter tank in that. They'd just probably be like, really?
Dude.
I want to subject myself to that.
I think something you said a little while ago is really prominent and really key. It's patience.
Oh, absolutely.
And as a general whole in keeping aquariums, it's be patient. Everything's got to go through its process to get to mature. And when you get mature, then that's when magic really begins happening inside your glass box.
Absolutely.
And that's no matter which sort of aquarium you're keeping, it's maturity and patience.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think patience is the key in every, as you pointed out, in any type of aquarium setup. And I think even much more so in the botanical method, because you're putting a certain amount of faith in nature. You're throwing this stuff into the tank, into the water, not knowing exactly how it's going to turn out, because things will break down. They will get redistributed by the current. They will get covered occasionally in fungal growth. Sometimes they don't. But the aquascape evolves without you having to necessarily do anything. And there's a certain amount of control you have to cede to nature. And some people don't want to do that. One of my friends, one of the guys I really like working with is George Farmer. George, he's a great technical aquascaper, but he also has a great appreciation for that. Let nature sort of do some stuff. And I think that's a great combination. He has a patience and an artist's temperament. Ty Stripeman, do you know Ty, John?
Yeah, you know Ty, yeah.
Really good friend. Ty has been to many of these habitats that I talk about, and he's given me a lot of neat photos. Ty gets it, because he understands what it's supposed to look like. So when you tied that together, I love Yvonne McColgie's book, the Orinoco.
Right.
It's a beautiful illustration of these habitats as they really are. There's nature as it is, and nature the way I think it is. But when you look at nature as it is, suddenly you become patient, because you go, oh, I could get that effect by letting nature do the work.
Exactly. There's flooded savannas that Ivan featured in for the Bolivian ram, or the electric blue ram. Sorry. Microzeophagus. And I couldn't believe the amount of algae that was present in their habitat. And that was when you're getting your macro lens, and you're going in, taking the same approach you would with a reef tank. You get right in there, you see the magic happening it's amazing. When you start looking at the tiny little bits of green come through on wood that you don't see when you stand back. Yeah. But when you're down there, you just see it, and the fish are pecking away at that. And
it's an explosion of life. And if you let your tank do that, it would be, you'd have your friends would be mortified when they see your tank covered with algae and stuff. And if you entered it in one of these contests, the judges would say, you don't know what you're doing. This is a mismanaged aquarium. Your fish would be very happy.
Yeah.
And it would be very authentic.
Something like this on your tank.
The best, exactly.
And then you can see it. It's just great.
Yeah, the little micro mesoscope. One of the things that I get periodically, we see, is we'll put a picture up of an aquarium, either it's ours or somebody else's, and somebody will actually think it's the wild, or even better, I'll post a lot of wild photos on my Instagram feed that Ty and other friends and myself we've taken on our trips, and people will say, whose tank is that? because now we've made such a mental shift in this botanical method world that our tanks look like nature. We've blurred the lines, as I like to say, between nature and aquarium as far as the look. That's a really cool thing. You don't see that a lot. You won't see that in the ADA style. You won't see that generally in reef aquariums, but you're starting to see that in these types of aquariums. People are saying, is that the wild, where is that? That's a great aquarium. No, that's the wild, that's an Orinoco somewhere. And that blows me away.
And if you get the angle right and you don't see any mechanisms in the background, you can't tell.
Can't. Just can't. And the fish can't tell either.
No.
It's their world, you know. So
yeah, they know nothing different.
They don't know anything different. Exactly.
Yeah. Cool. Do you want to jump back up to Spoon's comment that you started?
I
thought it was quite a relevant one as well. Sorry, you probably have it as Tim, not Spoon. Sorry.
And then I went on a tangent about it.
It's a big one, so I'll pop that up. So when dealing with different botanicals, is there a way to tell if they're going to be safe? So if you're out there collecting, basically, what do you look for when you're experimenting? When you're picking stuff up for the ground yourself, is there like a traffic light system that you would use, or is it just very much collect, boil, and go for it?
Yeah, it's a little of both. I mean, the important thing is I know that since the biosphere in New Zealand is very well studied, you could probably find a field guide to plants and animals of various regions, or perhaps even to poisonous plants. I think anything that is, my rule of thumb is if it's something that's known to be like poisonous to dogs and cats or even humans, I'm generally not going to use it in my aquarium. I'm just not. Yeah. But sometimes the only way I try to identify if it's something I collect, what it is. But honestly, at the end of the day, the thing that I do, if I find something that I really want to use, I will boil it, steep it for a few days overnight, put it in an aquarium. And God, I hate to use this word, but I put it in an aquarium with fishes that are, I don't want to say expendable, but fishes that I'm willing to lose in the interest of the greater good. And you just have to do that. Unfortunately, there's no guide to non-fish toxic botanical materials. There's just too many things on the planet. And quite honestly, one of the things I'm finding, at least here in Southern California, and I'm finding with my clients, my customers all over the world, just about any leaf, any twig, anything you use that's not known to be toxic works. Like leaves, I'm convinced pretty much you can use any leaf now. I used to be very like, oh no. If a leaf looks interesting to you, it's generally, if it's dried, fallen naturally, you could probably use it. The reason why you want it dried or fallen and dried is because a leaf has a store of sugars and carbohydrates and stuff that leaches out into your water, and that creates, and that's a nutrient issue. Could trigger algae or God knows what big bacterial spikes. So now, granted, in the nature, green leaves fall into the water. Of course, you have the benefit of millions of liters an hour flowing through somewhere. But could you experiment with freshly picked leaves? Sure, why not? But if you study the way leaves drop, there's basically these cells called excision cells that the tree sort of sends a signal, so to speak, that says, okay, it's time to drop because we're done. So it cuts it off from the rest of the tree and then it just falls. So it no longer has that intense amount of sugars and carbohydrates. Yeah.
It's almost like the tree prepares it for the water in advance.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So naturally fallen, my rule of thumb when I collect leaves is naturally fallen away from polluted areas. Don't collect butter or a car wash. The parking lot of a car wash or something or a car repair shop where there's oil and stuff. Common sense.
I get a lot of leaves falling into my back garden. I live next to a pond, so we get oak leaves, alder leaves, tweed, birch. One thing I do get is sycamore, and I've always been put off sycamore. I don't know why, but it's always somebody said at some point in my fish keeping to keep them out. But I don't know why.
It was pine. I know pine trees. It's the same thing. People say because there's this called pine tar. There's a sap. These saps have toxins or something that could be toxic. So I think that might be a similar thing. I just don't know. Mm-hmm. But most of the trees that put out cones, alder, birch, those kind of things, those cones are fine. So therefore, the wood should probably be okay too. And that's my theory anyway. So, and I've never had issues with alder twigs or birch twigs. So You have to be a little adventurous, and you have to be willing to take a few losses. I mean, when I was starting out, I was doing that, and when I had to source things from overseas, this looks interesting. This guy wanted to use it. He sells it to the United States for crafts. They people that make little display, little party favors or whatever they call them, the centerpieces. But I'm like, this might work in an aquarium before he starts treating it with lacquer or whatever they preserve it with. So I would try these things without it, and sure enough, they work. So you can definitely try a lot of different things, but you have to be willing to take a risk.
I think
when it comes to branches, sorry, Cam, when it comes to branches, oak leaves is probably one of the nicest.
Absolutely.
The texture, and they've got knuckles on them. They're brilliant, really good. It was oak leaves that I had in my stickleback tank.
Oh yeah, and they last a long time. What's interesting about oak leaves, they don't decompose like other leaves. They last a good long time under. I mean, I've had them literally a year underwater, and they hold their shape. They will accrue some biofilms, but
and they hold the bark as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Which I found really, normally the bark's off when you put wood in, but the oak I kept it on because it was just so nice, and it's
beautiful.
It was still on when I took it out a year later.
Cool. Well, it's apple bark and all the various bark that we get from the tropics. What makes them different? I mean, a tree is a tree, right? They're made of some of the same compositional materials, so why wouldn't it be okay? That's my theory. I'm not a botanist, so I can't tell you, but I mean, for the most part, these things work. I wouldn't be afraid to experiment.
Nick's brought up a point here with eucalyptus leaves, and that was what I was about to say. Like, the eucalyptus pods are quite okay. From my understanding, that the leaves and the bark are not so much, and like it's only the koalas that eat that, and they're kind of immune to it, but everything else that touches it causes trouble, and it's pretty much what Nick said there with his experience.
Exactly. That's what I've heard too with eucalyptus. I stay away from it because it does have a known medicinal kind of a astringent or antibacterial, some kind of a quality to it that I would be concerned. That's one I don't experiment with. I see a lot of pretty eucalyptus trees, and I think, wow, I'd love to grab those leaves and those cones, but I don't want to experiment with them.
The cones are okay.
The cones really are.
Yep, I've used them, no dramas. I know there's a place over in Australia that sell them. They specialize in kind of what you're doing over there, over in Australia, and they sell the eucalyptus cones or the pods or whatever you want to call them. Quite happily, quite content, but it's the leaves and the bark that are a no-go when it comes to that tree. Yeah.
And also I remember casuarina cones from the casuarina tree, which is from Australia. I remember when I started selling those, I got a lot of emails from people in Australia saying, "What are you doing? Those are toxic." No, they're not. The cone isn't. The toxic part, if you do the research, is the root of the tree. It puts out a poison to discourage other trees from growing in the area. It's a I forgot what they call it. They call it I forgot the process where basically it's putting out a defensive sort of a mechanism. So, but the cones themselves are not toxic. So it was kind of a misnomer. So again, there's nuances to all this stuff, but eucalyptus scares me, but I'm glad you're right. But the cones are probably fine, but the leaves I've always been a little bit shy to use. Yeah.
So if you're bringing new fish home from a pet shop with the intention of putting them into a botanical aquarium, what's your process for making sure that transition is good? Because the reality is most pet shops or fish shops don't have, tinted water, lower pH setups for their fish to be sold from. They're just a generic water base. So you have a process to that to make sure the fish aren't affected for the transition?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a slow, just like you would acclimate any fish to any new environment. There's nothing different. Do it very slowly, drip acclimation or whatever your favorite process is. I would do that over a series of, hours. No different. But that's a good question because now, honestly, all my tanks aren't, people look at the tanks that we do and they think, what is your pH? 5.9? No, 6.8, 6.7. I don't run low pH tanks because it's challenging to keep it that low, number one. And number two, once you get below a certain pH, nitrifying bacteria shut down. And then you have this other form of life called archaeans, which take over at lower pHs and do the same. They kind of run the nitrogen cycle at low pHs. So that's where the mystery starts. And people go, oh yeah, I can get my pH down to 5.3 or 4 point, whatever. It's like, then it becomes a little more interesting. Ammonia gets bound up as ammonium and it's not as toxic, but there's some challenges. There's a lot to it, but you can read up all about that stuff on Google and stuff. But my acclimation is just like any other situation that I would take fish from one environment and put it in another, just go slowly. Yeah.
Other than the standard, your aquarium's dirty because it's tinted, is there any other major misconceptions that you've found that people consider when looking into the style of aquarium?
I think the two misconceptions are, number one, the pH must be, what like I said, it must be 6.1 or 5. It's dangerous because it fluctuates, but no, they run very stable. Then you think about it, most of our aquariums, most even botanical method aquariums, we have substrate of some sort, which is enough of a buffer to keep your pH maddeningly higher than you'd like it. So that's not an issue. The other thing that's a misnomer is this detritus issue, and I've talked and written about this a lot, and you're probably bored hearing me talk about it, but people tend to look at detritus as this bad thing. No. There's a difference between detritus that's caused by decomposing botanical material and detritus from overfeeding and fish waste. That's a big difference. One's a husbandry issue, one's a ecosystem thing. And I think not all detritus is bad, and it just isn't. Again, detritus is a food source. So to fanatically have to get rid of every drop of this stuff, I think that's a big misnomer. People keep thinking that, you can't have detritus in your aquariums. That's good that we taught hobbyists this when they start out. And as an owner of a store, you tell people, siphon water, get the uneaten food. That's husbandry 101. And we've been doing that for 100 years now. And that's right. But my thing is, don't want to get fanatical and apply that to this type of tank, because if you can, otherwise it's a well-managed tank, just because it has some detritus caused by decomposing leaves on the bottom, that doesn't mean it's poorly managed or dangerous. So that's kind of a misnomer, I think, the detritus thing.
Yeah.
For
the record, I'd never get bored of listening to you talk about detritus.
Thank you. You know what's really funny? There literally is a hashtag going around on Instagram. Some guy decided it's like Detritus Tuesday and Tannin Tuesday or something. I'm like, I don't think he chose Tannin for my brand, but Tannins because of the watercolor. But it's literally like Detritus Thursday or something. You'll see people putting pictures up. I'm like, this is the weirdest freaking thing I've ever seen. We have come from, oh my God, your water looks dirty, to now we're celebrating detritus. I'm like, my mission is done. I can go home. But detritus, the mindset has to shift a little bit on that. So I think that's important.
I think Rebecca's just brought up a really, really valid point. That detritus is fascinating, and is definitely a disparity between science and hobby and literature and algae and how to work it all out 100%.
I think I was looking for something I had written down on that because I had a note about that, but I guess I didn't find it. I think he brings the perfect thing up. It's that there's a misnomer between detritus caused by a mismanaged aquarium and detritus caused by a natural process of decomposition. And I think that's important. That's an important distinction that we don't all make. And I think I'm glad that your listeners are so aware and bringing this. You have some really attuned listeners, and you guys are right on it too. You get it. And I think that's so important. And that's I think what's exciting about where we are in the hobby right now is we're not saying, screw all that history and the best practices of a century. We're just saying, no, wait, let's think about this. Is it always the right thing to do?
Correct.
It's not like what we had. And this guy, when I was in the reef hobby, I'd always have guys that would come up to me. I haven't changed the water in my tank in 2 years, and look how nice my corals are. I'm like, you're an idiot. This is stupid. It's a closed system. You've got to change water. You've got to, if for no other reason than to get some different minerals in there or whatever. But that's just stupid. That's just like, I put my hand on the stove and I haven't burned myself yet. Eventually it's going to catch up to you. That's just dumb. But people saying I'm not siphoning my detritus and my tank is doing okay, that's not stupid. That's questioning a practice and saying, is there a potential benefit to it? It's not like, look at me, I don't siphon detritus because I don't want to change water. It's like, no, that's not what it's about.
How do you combat detritus that's caused by fish waste, natural waste, when you've got a tank heavily covered with leaf litter?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, the key is to not have a tank heavy with fish waste. It's to feed sensibly and to. I'm a firm believer that most hobbyists know how to feed their fishes, and it's really new hobbyists who tend. I mean, you run a store. You should know. You probably see this more than I do. Like we tend to overfeed, right? But
oh, 100%.
Yeah, that's one of the big causes of algae. It's a big cause of health problems with fishes is overfeeding. I don't see that as much in these type of tanks, mainly because the people that are getting into it have a basic understanding of how to run a tank. First, I very rarely have a beginner in the hobby just say, "Oh, I want to have one of these tanks," and just start right.
Yeah.
You could do it, just like you could have a beginner do a high-tech planted tank or a reef tank and be successful, or a Lake Tanganyika tank. But most people start with a basic community tank with gravel and whatever, and evolve as their interests evolve. And I think they should, because you learn the basics. You can't fly an A380 right off the bat. You have to start in a Cessna. You could, but most likely you're not going to learn the things you need to know to operate the big boy unless you start with a small plane. So it's the same with an aquarium. I think we need to learn the basics. And my assumption, and I hate that word assumption, but my assumption has always been, when people come to my website or to my product, that they have a basic understanding of the aquarium hobby. Mm-hmm. I've had a few people that were outright beginners, but most of them are pretty experienced and or moderately experienced and just wanted to try something different. They were attracted to it, and more power to them. But if you study and if you learn the fundamentals, and if you team up with your local fish store or you have a mentor in the hobby, there's no reason why you couldn't start right at the beginning of this. You just have to understand what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I've actually got one of my own customers. He's not long been in the hobby, within sort of 6 months, and he's set up his first tank, and then all of a sudden now he's down the rabbit hole of botanicals. So he's gone very quickly from just this community sort of tank straight down into this journey, which has been fantastic. So and it's all learning, and he's loving every minute. And he's actually provided several of the questions that I've asked you today, because he wanted to know. I said, well, if you're wanting to know, let's try and get
out there.
Yeah.
Well, again, that's what's so cool is here's somebody that's relatively new in the hobby that was drawn to this sort of thing. I mean, when I started Tannin, I knew there had to be other people out there that would like this stuff, but the tribe sort of came together. But it was really the biggest challenge again was doing the things we talk about in the show, getting rid of those misnomers and the lack of understanding of basic aquarium fundamentals of what you're actually doing. Once you get through that, people kind of either love it or they don't, and that's fine. And I think that's what's so exciting right now is we are seeing, I mean, here's some guy halfway around the world from me who started this modern idea. You've probably been talking about it for years too, but he independently came up with this thing and said, I really like this type of tank. People have a certain thing. They like it. And that's what's so exciting. And now at least there's a body of work and a lot of people playing with this stuff, so people can be like, hey, there's information on this stuff. It's not history anymore. I like that.
Yeah, I think fire away, John.
I think one of the appeals for a lot of people is that you can go out and find botanicals. So you can combine walking in nature with your fish keeping. So it's not only just sitting at home connecting with nature by creating nature, you're actually out in nature as well. And you're feeling nature, and you're seeing it, and you're smelling it, and you're seeing it in action, and then you're taking all that back mentally and physically as well, and then mashing it all together into one huge hobby.
It is, and it's kind of like, I mean, a lot of fish people, I think we're all the same. Like when I walk by a natural body of water, no matter what it is, a pond, a ditch on the side of the road, you can't help but wonder, are there fish there? I kind of want to look to it. Yeah, I want to look at it. That's what we are. We're drawn to water. So it goes without saying that you're right. Like if you walk in nature and suddenly you're going, ooh, that tree fell in the woods. When you start studying these flooded South American forests, and for that matter, Southeast Asian forests, you look at when you hike in the forest, suddenly things are different. You're like, oh, I would like to do an aquarium that looks like that. And you could, because that's a real habitat. And that's what's so fascinating. You look at the forest floor and go, what accumulates on the forest floor? What's this, I've done a lot with soils and substrates lately in the last couple of years, because that's another component of this botanical method aquarium, or the natural aquarium, that we haven't really given much thought to. Planted aquarium people are really good at this stuff, but the rest of the hobby, it's just, oh, throw a bag of sand on the bottom and you're done. No, the substrate itself is a super dynamic, really interesting component of a botanical method aquarium, or any aquarium for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
It's its own living part of an aquarium. It's
100%.
Yeah, totally is. In your time of doing what you've been doing, has there been any sort of experimental techniques that you've come across that has sort of yielded some really interesting results, or you've done some tests that you never thought was going to result in this, or anything like that's kind of happened?
Yeah, I think the most, I think the biggest, most consequential experiment I did was that feeding, the self-feeding tank idea. Realizing that my hypothesis was correct. I guessed right on that, I guess, but that was a really big thing, realizing that the tank is an ecosystem. The other thing I played around with was, I've talked about these flooded forests. That's an environment I'm obsessed with. And I had a hunch. I said, you could recreate that whole dynamic in your aquarium. You can operate your aquarium. You could set up what essentially is like a terrarium, a forest floor with, some grasses, and some plants, maybe aquatic plants that could withstand that grow immersed or whatever, dry or whatever. I forgot the term. Is it immersed when they can grow out of water? Whatever, things that can survive out of water that can live in that transition. And then slowly flood it. Maybe put some frogs in there, take them out, start flooding it, and then leave it flooded. Add your fish, drain them, get the fish out, run it as a terrarium again for a few months. I've done that. I call it the urban agapo, for us city people, and it works. And it's super fun, and people are all over the world are duplicating that, and it's just a thing. You're operating your aquarium. You're playing God there. You can follow the natural cycles of inundation in the Amazon or whatever. You can operate your aquarium on a wet and dry cycle. You can start up an aquarium like that and then flood it and just keep it that way. You can do all sorts of things. I've done this. I have one I've done 13, 14, 16 cycles with, and I had killifish in it. Now, soil spawning South American killifish, Notholibius, I forgot the species. And they would lay their eggs. I would dry it out for the appropriate period of time. I wouldn't get a huge spawn when I re-wet it, but I would get some water. It's just like drying it in peat moss, which is what killie breeders do. But I would just let it sit in my substrate, and then they'd hatch out, and I'd have generations of fry growing up. So you can do kind of cool experiments like that, and that to me has been the most fun. And I like to see more people play with that. Yeah. And then brackish. I love playing with brackish because you could use this whole approach with brackish. A lot of substrate-centric, leaf litter-centric stuff with mangroves. I've done a lot of fun brackish water experiments, and that should be another area of the hobby that should be a lot more fun. We're working on, making that bigger here too. So I think brackish, there's a lot to be done, and this whole botanical idea in general, lots of experiments that people can do.
Yeah, brackish is something that I've never even delved into, even started reading or listening or watching. It's again another element that's within keeping 4 pieces of glass glued together, 5 pieces of glass glued together. Yeah,
and there's some fascinating interactions. The whole brackish is actually the estuaries and mangals, the mangrove forests. Those are actually sort of a great example of if you want to call them nature's botanical method system, because leaf litter drop from mangroves powers those ecosystems, and detritus and substrate and silt and all. It's the same philosophy. It's just with brackish water. And the fishes are a little harder to come by, but rainbow fishes and things are probably a little easier down in your part of the world to get. But there's possibilities there too. And I think as hobbyists, we've been presented again. The brackish water aquarium was, white sand, a bunch of rocks, and whatever. And that was the brackish aquarium that most hobbyists saw. And it was boring and ugly. And suddenly when you start and you say, this has nothing to do with the natural habitats that the fish come from. And if you start looking at these real environments, suddenly brackish becomes a lot more interesting, just like blackwater, just like botanical. So I love looking at different natural ecosystems and saying, how can we replicate this in the aquarium? And we can. There's lots of ways to do it.
For sure. We've just had a comment come up, and this is the second or maybe the third third one of these just to say thank you for being here. And I think you're opening a lot of people's minds and ideas and thoughts right during this, which is fantastic. So, yeah.
I think that if there's one thing that I'm proud that I've done, if I can look back on my hobby career and my aquarium business career, it's like I've at least taught people that you can look at things differently like that. That's so important because the hobby, as you know, people get out of the hobby. They get bored, you know, during COVID lockdowns and stuff here, at least in the States and in Europe. I know a lot of people got really into their hobby, and then, you know, because they had nothing else going on, they couldn't get to work or whatever. It became really important. But some people are lifetime hobbyists, and some people leave the hobbyist because they're frustrated with equipment or algae or they're bored or what. So it's always nice to have new ideas, and especially with longtime hobbyists, to get people out of that stubborn mindset that we sometimes get. Fish people are stubborn, as you know. I think that's so important to look at things differently. Now, the one thing I like to do is question why we do stuff. Not to be a jerk, but to say, well, why do we siphon the hell out of our substrate? Why do we, you know, keep fish in this sort of a way? Why do we operate a tank like this? I think if we question it, the answer is usually, well, because that's what works for the greatest number of people. And the idea is to give people the best chance of success. But for those outliers that want to try something different, you can. But for some reason, we've made it very intimidating for hobbyists in general to try something new. And people are I got a lot of pushback when I started this thing. I got a lot of nasty emails about, how can you push this kind of stuff? It's dangerous. It's reckless. You're teaching people bad habits. Da, da, da. I've heard it all. And now we have Detritus Tuesday. So
there you go.
Yeah, you just have to believe.
So one question I get quite often with people that are looking into this is, do you remove the breaking down leaf litter or botanicals that are, like, I know where you stand on that, but do you want to explain where you stand on that and why you stand on those points? Yeah,
you could. I know people like, do you know the Sensky brothers at Aquarium Design Group? Are you familiar?
Yeah.
And Mike. Okay, Jeff and Mike were one of the first people that contacted me when I started, and they said, "You got to send me some leaves, send me some stuff." Jeff is a brilliant aquascaper, a brilliant thinker.
Brilliant podcast.
He's a great podcast guest. He likes a certain clean aesthetic, but he loves the natural look of things. But he likes his tanks clean. He would not handle the leaf breaking down, so as soon as they start softening, he would take them out and put new ones in, which is fine. His tanks look brilliant. They're amazing. Could you do that? Absolutely. His tanks aren't an ecological representation. They're an artistic representation. And that's totally fine. That's his thing. And no one in the world is better at it, in my opinion, than him. I leave my leaves in until they completely break down for the reasons that we talked about before, because I don't want to deprive those organisms of food. Yeah. It looks more natural, and I just don't see a compelling reason. The only reason I'll take leaves and stuff out is if they start clogging my filter intakes or something, and it's just getting to be a nuisance. I'll take those pieces out. But no, I leave stuff until it completely breaks down, because essentially it becomes inert or intact, so it's not a problem.
Yeah, I actually enjoy watching them break down.
Yeah,
there's certain leaves they break down differently. Some of them just fizz away, and all you're left with is actually like a skeleton. And then some go like that Madagascar lace type. Yeah. And they're really fascinating. I do.
Yeah. James he loves taking pictures of broken down botanicals. And they really do look incredible like that. And again, it's nature. Decay is that's another topic we talk about in my blog and podcast, and probably you don't hear much of that talked about in the aquarium hobby, but it's a fundamental concept with the botanical method aquarium. Decay is really important. It's a natural phenomenon that we as a hobby freak the hell out about because we think it's bad. Again,
it just becomes part of that ecosystem and the food web, and just
fuels the food web. It's like taking out gasoline from the engine. Yeah, it's and if you want to be aesthetic about it, again, look up Google wabi sabi. As a mono would talk about it. It's the transience of existence. So you could look at it artistically too.
Yeah. In my experience, it adds maturity to an aquarium.
Absolutely.
And balance. And I'm all about leaving it in there, and unless it's blocking everything up, just leaving it in there and letting it do its thing, letting it break down, and just, again, aesthetically, it looks cool at the same time, but just letting it do its thing.
There's something very appealing about seeing nature play out in the aquarium. And I think once you get, again, I always talk about these mental shifts, but once you make that mental shift that says, this is not harmful, this is what happens in nature. And if you just look at pictures of natural underwater ecosystems and then look at your tank, you'll be like, yeah, that looks darn similar. You realize this is what nature does. This is what she's done for billions of years, and nature works. It's only when we interfere with pollution and carbon emissions, that's what's screwing up nature, not nature screwing up nature. We're screwing it up. So it's the same with an aquarium on a microcosm level. It's like, it's our interference with natural processes instead of embracing them that freaks them out. That's why I have a hunch. That's why these nature aquariums and these contests, they break them down after 3 months. It would be a really pain in the butt to manage one of those things for years because there's a lot of work involved and people don't want to do it. Whereas one of these things, you can let it go. What would happen if you let one of those nature aquariums go? It would probably look really cool because it would suddenly, nature would grow the plants where it wants to grow. The grasses would overgrow, the glossostigma or whatever would overgrow the rock because that's what nature wants to do. All we're doing is giving nature what it wants to do. We're just not working with plants. We're working with botanicals.
Yeah.
And suddenly going, that's pretty cool looking. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Do you have a favorite species of fish to work with or in your setups, or is there one that's really surprised you how well they've gone for you?
Yeah, I do. I mean, my favorite fish have always been characins. I love tetras. I like them because I like small fish and big tanks, or even in medium or small tanks. I just like small fish. That being said, I like when I decide what I want to keep. Sometimes I'll look at a fish. Like I did a tank just about the Tucano tetra, which is one that I really, really fascinated by that fish. And it's only found in a very small locale, a very small geographic area in a specific stream or whatever. And it has specific characteristics, root tangles and so forth. So I was fascinated by it. I was looking up what the Tucano tetra wild habitat is about. And I found the original ichthyological description of that fish from the 80s or 90s when it was found. And they talked about the river, the stream where it was found in, and talked about the material that fell in the water and blah, blah, blah. And that's where the fish live. And I'm like, oh, this is amazing. So I developed the tank around their environment. So if I find a fish that comes from a compelling environment, I'll use that fish. Rainbow fish, I find fascinating because they come from these interesting brackish environments. Killifish, because they come from these transitional habitats. If I had to say what I think are my favorite fish to work with, definitely would be tetras. I would love to do something with bigger fish like knife fish. My favorite fish in the whole world is the black ghost knife fish.
Yeah,
I almost bought one of them today.
I love that fish.
Yeah, I was just mesmerized by it. I was like,
isn't it cool? It's the coolest fish ever. And they would do really well in a botanical method aquarium because they like all that feeding spot. There's a couple of fish. There's a fish called the sailfin tetra. You ever seen that one? That's a really cool fish because it comes from a habitat like we talk about. That's where it lives. It lives in these little ponds that have tons of leaf litter and stuff. It's almost like a dwarf cichlid the way it acts. They have a hierarchy, and they're very interesting fish. That was one of my dream fishes for years and years, and I finally got a few years ago. Love them. What I would love to play with, zebra danios. I would love to do, if you study the habitat of the zebra danio, they're found in both fast-moving streams, and then they're found in rice paddies that are silt and leaves and all this stuff. And I'm like, wow, you could do a really authentic zebra danio tank. That would be super cool.
They're very underrated, the zebra danio.
Very underrated. Any danio, yeah, they're great fish. Danios are cool. I think I've kept tons and tons of marine gobies, but I'm starting to get really interested in those Stiphodon gobies. I would love to do a habitat for those fish. I started playing with some substrate mix. That's another obsession of mine. And I came up with a substrate mix that sort of replicates the habitats that they come from. And I'm like, now I want to keep Stiphodon gobies. So that's what I operate in that. Like, what's an environment that I find interesting? What lives there, and how can I replicate it? That's how I go. But yeah, fish. I love live bears. A friend of mine did a beautiful wild swordtail tank that looks like the wild habitat of swordtail, and I'm like, that's super cool.
Cool.
Like, people don't do that, He did it. I thought that was amazing. So, yeah.
Where do you get your inspiration from? Do you go out looking for stuff? Do you get to go to a lot of natural ways where your fish and stuff are from, or is it a lot of researching, reading, talking, watching, all that sort of thing, and then just developing your own stuff?
Yeah, it's a little of both. I mean, I've done a fair amount of traveling. I haven't traveled as much, ironically enough, even though I've worked for an airline, I haven't traveled as much. But I like to, when I'm out and about, if I see something that an aquatic environment that looks interesting, I'll explore it. I love reading. I love the research papers, because once you get past the dry diagrams and abstracts, there's really good information about these habitats. South America, the Amazon basin, is very well studied. There's still so much we don't know, but it's very well studied, and there's a lot of great information in scientific papers. So I love taking that information and translating that into hobby, what we can do here in the hobby. And I think that has yielded a lot of information. Friends like Ty Streitman, Ty's coming out with a book.
Yes.
It's going to be a brilliant book when it comes out. I think it comes out in the fall.
Yeah, it does.
About that. Yeah. And he's been to those environments. He did his master's research for his master's degree in South America in some of these flooded pantanal wetlands. So yeah. We have a lot of Ty's pictures on our website, and because there's such amazing habitats, and he tells me all about the tetras he saw. And so I listen to people, I talk to people, I research that. I just love looking at wild habitats. There's some great, if you can YouTube and put underwater flooded forest, there's some brilliant videos. Just look at those. I freeze the frame and look at it. And while other people maybe are looking at the fish, I'm looking at what's around. Oh, look at that rock. Oh, look how that seed pod. That's where I get the ideas. So, and anybody can do this. You can go on Safari on the internet and find all kinds of stuff and do an amazing aquarium and maybe make a breakthrough in the hobby that no one even thought about. So that's what it's all about to me.
I think in the last 2 years, there's been an increase in biotope contests as well, which, like the Biotope Aquarium project, that holds a lot of set in stone kind of information where you look at the map, you pick a location, it homes in. I know your website's got very similar kind of information, the way you put it forward, it's all categorized as well. And I think that's really helpful for people, especially myself, when I think, right, I like a fish, where does it come from? How do I make a biotope?
Yeah.
And then you get that, it's like an all-in-one pack of information where you can see the plants, everything that you need, and then you work from there. Because obviously not everything's available to everybody, so kind of swapping out things, but keeping it as close as possible.
The other thing too is, remember too, that we can use as an excuse is different times of the year, there's different things in those environments. Maybe there's less aquatic plants, the water's shallower, maybe there's more debris, maybe there's more leaf litter, maybe the water's more turbid. So you can model a season. So you don't have to be limited to just, this is an agapo, this is a Varzea forest, whatever. The other thing too, I forgot what I was going to say. I was thinking when you were talking about the biotope contests and so forth, the other thing I think that's interesting too is, even though the biotope contest is probably primarily about aesthetics, there's a good educational component, which I think is kind of cool. I sometimes laugh at the judging, where the judges really trash on, this kind of rock is not found there, yet they're having an alder cone or some kind of a leaf from, Northern Europe, but they're not noticing that. But so you can get away with a lot of different things, in terms of using what you got. So, that's why contests always kind of get me, because they're so subjective and judgmental for some people. But I think it's cool that people are really striving to produce some amazing tanks. The coolest tanks I've ever seen in those contests, there's some guy in Vietnam that he literally, I think what he did was take a chunk of soil from a local pond, drop it in his tank, put some plants in there. It was the coolest aquarium I think I'd ever seen in a contest. And they just trashed this guy, saying how it wasn't sustainable. And even though this guy had maintained it for over a year, like, it's not sustainable. There's going to be hydrogen sulfide. And they were coming up with every reason to destroy this poor guy's entry. And I thought it was brilliant. So when you're an outsider, you don't think like a judge. I could never. They asked me to judge the biotope division of the Aquatic Gardeners Association convention, and I turned it down because of that reason. I couldn't judge somebody based on that. I couldn't do it.
No,
probably a mistake, but I just couldn't do it.
Yeah. Do you want to bring Rebecca's comment up? You can read it because I can't say those words.
On your podcast, you mentioned gymnotiformes. I'm not sure how you pronounce it.
Gymnotiformes, I think. Yeah.
Gymnotiformes. And they are amazing fishes and fascinating. Most would benefit in a setup like yours, but a real challenge to get enough food.
Yeah, they certainly wouldn't be able to sustain themselves because they're carnivorous or eat insects, and you could put bloodworms or larvae, but you'd have flying larvae in your house. I don't think you'd want that, but you'd have to feed. But those kind of fishes do well in the physical setup. You just have to supplementary feed because you can't produce the type and quantity of food that they need unless you have fishes that are reproducing enough to give them small fish supplies. So that's a good point. Same with people told me, can you keep earth eaters in one of these tanks? Well, earth eaters eat leaf litter. They sift through it. They sift through detritus and stuff. So you could keep them in one of these tanks. They would tear it up. It would be completely a mess, but it would be very natural. So some fishes in search of food can destroy your habitat as well. But yeah, a fish like that needs to be fed. Good point.
So, prior to us coming on, I said there was going to be no questions that were going to challenge you. I've thought of a question as we're going, so I'm hoping it doesn't challenge you too much.
Okay.
If I was to give you a 3-foot aquarium right now with nothing in it, can you go from the bottom all the way through the top and how you would set it up and how your mind works on that process?
Oh, okay. That's a good question. If you give me a 3-foot aquarium right now, I think what I would look at, I would do one of two things right now. 3 different things I would probably do. First idea I would do would probably be a habitat for, I think I would do a larger scale version of what I did for the Tucano Tetra. I would start with a fine sand bottom, like whitish sand, mixed in with maybe some pulverized or very fine plant soil, aquatic plant soil, maybe even some terrestrial plant soil to give that kind of a dirty, varied look. I'd crush up some twigs, mix that into the substrate. Then I would probably put some larger twigs on the surface there of the substrate, and I would build it up with even more twigs, like oak branches or some kind of branches. That would be my main hardscape right there. And then maybe I would get some ficus plants and try to have them over the tank and have their leaves go into the water, or palm fronds. I would use some palm fronds in there and just lay them into the matrix of the branches I presented. And it would be, I would try to represent the side of a stream where it drops off, because that's where that fish comes from. And I would, if I had the budget, I'd get 100 Tucano tetras. I would do the same with the neon tetra, for that matter, or any tetra.
Yeah.
The other tank I would do, I would like to do, again, I've done this before, but I would do it again now on a larger scale, a mangrove tank with a very thick, muddy bottom. Some live mangroves, I'd root maybe 4 or 5 mangroves and let them grow. And then I would use the blue eye, the pseudomugil, God, I forgot the name. You know the one I'm talking about?
Yeah.
I would do blue eyes, and I'd go brackish or orange chromides, which I've done before, which those would be really amazing. The other thing I would do would be what we talked about earlier, a Danio tank. Sand. I would start out by running the tank dry. I would get some rice seeds, and I would grow some rice, or acarus, which is called, also known as sweet flag. It's a fish it's a plant that can withstand a dry and a wet environment. I would set that up for 3 or 4 months, let the plants grow. Then I would flood it. I would have some branches, some of these plants, maybe a few little pebbles here and there, a very silty substrate. And I would throw in like 30 maybe leopard danios, because I think they're cool, but zebra danios would work in a pinch. And as turbid, as murky as that tank might be, I would just do that, and I would just look at a really cool natural Danio tank. Those would be the 3 things I'd play with now.
Cool. As you were building that up, I was building it up in my head, and I'm sure other people were, and can sort of visualize what you were saying as you were saying it. Yeah, it was really cool.
Well, because I think that's how I think, and I think if we think of our tanks from the bottom up, I love the way you asked that question, because if we think of tanks from the bottom up, it's not just building, again, it's not just the aesthetic. If we go, how does the habitat work? The aesthetic comes with it. We're so worried because of this stupid thing and Instagram, and we want to see, you know, it's got to look good for the gram. Start your tank out with sand. You know, one of the coolest pictures in McColgee's book, is a picture of the God, I forgot what fish it was. It was a live bear, and it's a scene where the sand, it's a tinted water, and it's just the riverbank where this
and it goes down,
and there's no plant, no twigs, no, maybe a couple of leaves. That's it. And I'm like, I want to do that. That would be one of the coolest tanks ever. And it has no scape, essentially. It's just a downward slope of sand, drop off, and tinted water. And I'm like, that would be so different and ecologically sound and just beautiful. Those are the kind of things that fascinate me, being able to do that sort of stuff, you know? And there's so many experiments beyond just let's use this moss covering this branch and a cloud forest. It's like, no, do something like that. If I had 1/10 of the talent of some of these guys that enter these contests, I would do tanks that nobody could even imagine, because, and I don't want to sound arrogant, but I mean, I would just do crazy stuff because I would have the talent.
Mine works slightly differently.
So I think we need to push the limits, explore environments like karsts. Karsts are these very alkaline habitats in South America and I think Africa, where there's certain kinds of fishes come from that very hard alkaline water. What about a temporal pool, like a mud hole in in Africa, in Tanzania, where you have annual killifish? Why not do a mud hole? Why not? No one's ever done that. There's
tidal pools.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's so many things we can do, and we're not doing them. And that's what excites me. That's what motivates me, is that if I can get one guy to do something crazy like that, it would just be so cool, because people would be so inspired by that. And it's all from nature. It's not from last month's tank of the month or this contest winner. It's from nature. She's been doing it 1 billion years. She's got this stuff down. We just have to listen to her, you know? It's cool.
You've mentioned a little bit earlier about substrate mixes are kind of where you're sort of really interested in at the moment, and obviously you spoke about that as you were building up those tanks. Yeah. Do you want to go into a little bit more depth of where that is being developed from you and what you're playing around with, that kind of stuff?
I always joke that, like, if I didn't start Tannin, I would have started a company that makes sand and substrates. I just love substrates. I've always liked sands and unique gravels and things like that. The companies that make them are cool, and they have some great products, but there's so much more to most of these environments. If you look at, again, environments like flooded forests that we talk about incessantly here, those are soils called podzols. It's a very an acid soil. It's a lot of clay, a lot of sediment. It's very nutritionally poor for forest plants, yet it does grow aquatic plants, interestingly enough. So I made my own version of podzolic soil, and it's a sediment. I call them sedimented substrates.
I was just about to ask you about that.
Yeah.
That's so strange.
It can make your water cloudy initially, but it settles out. And I use it to grow my little urban agapo plants, these transitional plants. When I operate those types of tanks, works great. Agapo are forests that are flooded by blackwater rivers. And then there's what are called varzea, which are much better in terms of plant coverage. Those are flooded by whitewater rivers or clearwater rivers in South America. So I did two. Initially, I developed a varzea substrate and an agapo substrate, and they work really great. I use them in my little urban agapos experiments. I think you can use them in all kinds of tanks. Unfortunately, they're expensive because the ingredients I get are not just, sand here and this and that. It's some of the stuff's expensive and hard to source. So I can't produce them in huge quantities. They're like hand mixed, like people would make beer or coffee. It's like batch. I made one like to stimulate the Borneo peat swamp forests, where it's a two-part component. It's a substrate, kind of almost like a muddy, silty substrate component. And then we have a botanical packet of crushed up certain types of botanicals and leaves and twigs that you would boil and drop in there on top and mix it in. So that's where I'm at right now mentally. I have another one that's designed more for like a South American harder water rivers, like more of a gravelly type substrate. I have a few others I'm working. I was trying to play around with a karstic substrate. but just stuff like that. I think because the reason why substrates are so interesting to me is because they're the forgotten component. You mentioned it earlier. There's a whole microbiome that lives there. There's a whole, it's called a benthic environment at the bottom. There's a whole group of organisms which support the system that we just, it's an afterthought to most of us. So we just throw down some sand and we're done. But the reality is, if you make it hospitable for them by mixing in things like leaves and so forth, not only does it influence the aquarium chemically, but it influences it ecologically. Again, I don't fully understand all the function of these things. There's a whole science to studying substrates, but by creating these interesting little micro habitats within your aquarium, you're creating a very ecologically diverse system. And I think that's basing an aquarium on substrate. That's why I was so fascinated by that Nicolji picture. I'm like, that's the, to replicate that in an aquarium would be a triumph of that theory of like the substrate is the system. I think that's interesting to me, but I think substrates are something we should experiment more with. And it's not just gravel and sand, it's mixes of things, because nature, if you look again, as I did for years at all these pictures, and when I've traveled and you look at the bottom of one of these type of environments, it's not sand. In some areas it's sand, but mostly it's a matrix of mixed up stuff, sediments, dirt.
When I was making a flooded savanna biotope,
oh wow,
I had research that was on a blog that Ivan had written, and he talked about Orinoco soup. That's what he called it, where you're just taking all the leaves and everything and breaking it down and boiling it and mulching it, and you know, I really enjoyed that part. And
we've been told for years, oh, you can't put stuff in the substrate, it'll rot and create hydrogen sulfide. That's a bunch of, well, I can't say the word, but it's a bunch of stuff. Can I cuss here? Because you know I cuss. Okay, it's a bunch of bullshit. Because who mismanages their aquarium enough to get hydrogen sulfide deposits in their 2-inch sand bed?
Exactly.
An incompetent fool. You could mix all, I've been doing this for years. I'd mix coconut core, peat moss, bits of bark. You can mix all kinds of stuff in your substrate. Look at a real river bottom. Don't look at last year's contest winner with the white sand. Look at actual habit. I'm not yelling at you guys. I'm ranting because, you know, that's what I do.
Well, this tank here, I've used the same substrate.
Right, behind exactly. That's what it's about.
It's got some shells from old snails. It's got, you know,
that's what
bark, pods, everything. And
that's a beautiful substrate. If I could market something like that, that's the next step, is a live substrate.
Well, I mean, something that you're doing just now is the enhancement media, which is something I've noticed in your. Could you add that? Would you recommend adding that at the start, or is it possible to add that halfway through, you know, to a wet flooded tank? Too messy.
It's going to be messy. That's the problem. When we sell those things, it's really designed to be used from the start. Can you add it? Sure, it'll sink to the bottom eventually, but you're going to make a mess. If you don't mind the mess, it's not going to harm your fish. It's just going to look, again, just because it looks bad doesn't mean it's bad. Just because dirt, literally terrestrial dirt, will cloud your tank, it doesn't mean it's bad. One of the things I revisit is the Wallstad method, as they call it. I think that lady got a lot of heat for her idea. A lot of people were not happy with that idea, but it works. And I think it's fascinating because, again, she was approaching it like a holistic, a lot more educated woman than I am in terms of that stuff. But I read her book again, and I'm like, there's a lot in there to take away, not just for plants, but think about substrates as a dynamic ecosystem, like what John has behind him there. Like, to me, that is every bit as exciting as growing plants. It's really interesting subject that we have in the hobby have done very little with. So I'm going to try to change that. And I hope all of our community does too. I know a lot of guys trying to make their own mixes too. It's fun.
Yeah. Some of the best substrates I've ever had was like, I pulled down this aquarium, pulled down this one. They just end up going in buckets for a while. Then and it becomes mixed, and I'll throw, and then all of a sudden you've got this complete mixture of all sorts of everything. And oh, what's that? Well, I don't know. I've just mixed it all together, and it's just worked.
I've been using that same substrate for 2 years.
That's amazing. Again, very rarely, I don't want to say rarely, but in a lot of aquatic habitats, when you've been to some of these, and any habitat you go to, very rarely is it a uniform material.
Mm.
I mean, I think the first study of the Amazon, they said it was fine white sand in the bottom of the Amazon. That's the main channel of the Amazon. Yeah, it makes sense because it's ground up stones from the Andes or whatever. But in these small tributaries where most of our fishes come from, because we're not keeping 40-inch long pacu or whatever, we're keeping little fish that live in these little tributaries. It's a mix of stuff. And I think we sell ourselves short when we just put a bunch of sand on the bottom and call it a day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So
it just adds texture, doesn't it? If anything, if nothing else, it adds beautiful texture.
It's aesthetically nice. Nothing. And that's what, honestly, I have to admit, initially that's what drew me to this idea of substrate enhancement and throwing things in there. Is I wanted it to look like the natural habitat. And then I started realizing after a while, Scott, you're being stupid. Why does it look that way? Because that's what nature did. It distributed this stuff. And why does it work that way? And what happens there? And then I realized it's functional. So that term functional aesthetics I like to use is something that it happens to look good, but it performs a function. So functional aesthetics is a big thing in my world. And that's what substrate is. It's functional aesthetics. Mm-hmm. You know, it's
100%.
And I don't think as a hobby have grasped all the potential cool things we can do with these substrates yet.
No, definitely not.
We will.
Totally agree.
Yeah, not yet. We're just scratching the surface. And that's what's so fun. Everybody can contribute to this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Certainly. Yep. Long term, do you feel there's any negatives of running this sort of botanical method aquarium, whether it be on the fish or anything like that, or it's pretty smooth sailing long term as well?
Long term, these tanks do great. I think the longest I've had one of these tanks that's a true tank with like leaf litter and all that stuff, the longest I've ever had one going continuously is about a little under 6 years. And the only reason I broke it down is because I was moving. They can run indefinitely for a very long period of time with no real new, I mean, just adding some more stuff as things break down, obviously, but just with regular maintenance, no. I've had no long-term issues, no long-term health effects, no old tank syndrome or whatever people call it. It's a well-managed tank otherwise, you filter it, you change water. It's no different. It's just a tank that relies on nature to do a little more of the heavy lifting, that's all.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
So, I assumed that would be your answer. Again,
yeah,
someone asked that, and so,
No, that's a good question because, we're, again, in our hobby, we're so used to seeing what's on the phone and, on Instagram, these tanks are up. And then 3 months later, the guy has a different tank. And it's like, what, how, what, these tanks stay up a long time. We do a lot of different looks, but I do a lot of different tanks. It pains me as when I was really hardcore into building tannin into this thing, I had to show a lot of different looks because I wanted to show so I'd go through tanks quickly because I only set up so many tanks. And it was heartbreaking sometimes. Oh, this tank's great. I'd love to let it go. And I was breaking my own rule of just letting the tank go forever. And I was doing new tanks every 3 months. And I was like, I'm one of those people. But no, you can let them run a long period of time. And I think it's a misnomer. Yeah.
So that's basically come to the end of the questions that I've got.
Awesome.
Also, we're getting pretty close to me having to open up the shop. So
yeah,
like to end all of our guest interviews with a school of 6, which is 6 really quick, short answer questions.
Sure.
None of them are going to put you on the spot, I assure you. So first of all, heads or tails?
Tails.
Tails never fails.
Yep.
Are we alone in the universe?
Absolutely not.
Cool. If you could have a meal with absolutely anybody alive, dead at any point in the world of history or history of the world, who would it be?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Maybe anybody alive. I think it might be, speaking of the universe, maybe Carl Sagan.
Cool.
That'd be an interesting guy to talk to.
Paper, scissors, rocks. What's your first call?
Oh, well, I'm not a big fan of rocks, so I'd take paper.
Are you a tea or a coffee drinker?
I'm a coffee drinker, but I love tea.
Fair.
But I'm primarily coffee. Yeah.
Cool. And if you could have a unicorn fish, whether that be in an aquarium, seeing it in the wild, photograph, anything, what would your unicorn fish be?
It would be, there's a species, speaking of knife fish, I forgot the name. It's about this big. And it's a very cool looking, kind of brownish with little striped knife fish. Never been in the hobby. I've got to get the name, but it's just small knife fish. And I think a small knife fish would be a game changer because you could have it in a 50-gallon tank or whatever, or a 200-liter tank, and not worry about it getting 3 feet long. I think a small knife fish would be cool. That's my unicorn fish. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Oh, that's the 6 that I've got, and that's the questions. So thank you.
Thank you.
Where can people find you? Where do you sort of hang out, and your website and all that kind of stuff? If people want to learn more about what you do and everything else.
Yeah, it's tanninaquatics.com. That's my website. Obviously we sell product, but and right now we're revamping it, so we don't have a lot of product in stock. So it's not necessarily selling. I'm still putting out the blog every day as we do our new site. So there's a blog there and a link to our podcast called The Tint, but that's available on all the podcatchers. So I try to do that at least 4 or 5 times a week. Sometimes it's daily, just depends on the rhythm I get and what I feel like talking about. It's anywhere from 5 to 30 minutes. Sometimes we have guests, yeah, that's where you can find me. And then if you hit me up on Instagram, I'm very active on Instagram just because I write the little mini blogs with my pictures. I try to be a little different. So that's probably our best photo representation of a lot of our work would be Instagram. I think you can see our work and the community's work. So yeah, there you go.
I'd very much encourage anyone to find your podcast. It is really, really good.
I shared the link earlier on in our live stream, and I've just shared the link to the website as well. So
thank you.
Everybody
I think you guys on, actually. I think it would be really fun to have you guys on one time. I think we need to arrange that, have you on the tent.
For sure.
I would love to get your perspective as a retail guy, your experiences with things, because you're doing a lot with interesting tanks too. And John, just talking about that tank behind you, I'm like, we could do a whole show on that. So yeah, we should do that. Well, let's make plans to do that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on.
Yep. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks.
The whole time we've been talking, I've sort of felt, this sounds like I'm just listening to one of your podcasts. It's been absolutely
authentic.
Great. Yep. So thank you very much. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I know there has been a lot of people that have been watching that have had their minds expanded just from the comments. And I've got a couple of messages flashing on my Facebook Messenger that I know is going to be related to this. So thank you very much. It's greatly appreciated. So
thank you for doing what you do, because I think that's so important to have different guests and talk about just different topics like this. It's great. It's really appreciated. So thank you.
Yeah, the aquatic hobby is just so broad. There's so much you can do within it. So
endless.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, have a good morning and good evening.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Yeah,
both you. Take care.
Have a good one, Tim.
Bye, guys.
Catch you later.
Bye.
Oh, where's my button?